The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
CEOs have had a formidable foe in antitrust regulators in recent years. Margrethe Vestager in Europe and Lina Khan in the US were keen to flex their muscles when it came to blocking deals that they felt could drive up prices or harm smaller companies. But in the past year, there has been a changing of the guard in America, the UK and Europe, and they all have one thing in common: a more hospitable attitude towards deals. Or at least that's what bankers hope. Whether it's the UK's drive for growth or Europe's ambition to create companies that can compete with international rivals, it looks like deals that may have been blocked in the past could be resuscitated. What this means for business and economies is the focus of this week's Viewsroom. Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that invites you, the listener, into a lively debate with Breakingviews columnists about the big stories of the week. And I'm your host, Amy Donlan.
And I'm Jonathan Guilford.
So, Jonathan, under the Biden administration, when you had Lina Khan at the FTC and Margrethe Vestager at the European Commission, you really saw this high watermark moment in international cooperation on antitrust issues in a way that really vexed the tech industry and got entangled with all these arguments about whether European regulation is specifically trying to hobble American tech giants. Now we still have some pretty strident anti-big tech rhetoric, but it seems like that relationship is going to shatter under the Trump administration. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think so. You had a lot of conservative voices and a lot of, let's say, folks who wanted to keep big tech within the Democratic Party tent, very worried about this relationship between Europe and the US that we saw under the Biden administration. And of course, this is something that has evolved from the days under the Bush admin when there were big kind of EC US blow-ups that kind of got paved over a little bit. You ended up with the agencies sort of following each other's leads in the years after that. But now we have an administration that just does not care about transatlanticism, to be quite frank. There are still working groups at the FTC and so on, but it's not really clear where this is going to go. And I think that's a really good scene setter for kind of what we're going to be talking about today, because it's now really a possibility that Europe and the US will be able to go their own ways, the UK as well, and chart this course that kind of moves away from what seemed like a kind of Western pact, effectively, to try and restrain big tech. And of course, we got a great guest to talk with us about this today, Liam Proud, an editor in our London office in Europe, who has been covering these issues with great enthusiasm. Liam, welcome back to the Viewsroom.
Great to be here, guys.
So, Liam, can you give us a bit of a context as to how Europe had previously been approaching antitrust issues when it comes to deals? There's been a few high-profile examples of deals that were intended to compete with American and Chinese giants, but they got blocked, right? And now there's this whole question of how does that fit into emerging industrial policy?
Yeah, so the context here is that for a long time, the marquee figure in European antitrust was Margrethe Vestager, who Amy mentioned at the beginning, who is the Danish competition commissioner for the European Union for 2 terms, so for 8 years. So she was there for a long time, and she really set the tone as a kind of quite aggressive, muscular trustbuster, basically. So the main kind of landmark deals that she blocked, the big one was Siemens Alstom. There was supposed to be a train merger, and the idea was that this would help European industrial champions compete with massive Chinese and North American behemoths, and be able to hold their own on the global scale. So this was a deal that was incredibly popular in the political capitals in Paris and Berlin, and which was not very popular in the Brussels antitrust department. So that was a moment where this stuff kind of came to a head, and there was a lot of political outcry about Brussels holding Europe back, about stopping Europe from doing industrial policy. You saw this flurry of white papers from national governments saying we need to kind of rethink how we do this. We need to make merger guidelines more sensitive to kind of the requisite scale that European companies need. Fast forward to a few months ago, the new European Commission has come in, and Vestager has been replaced by Teresa Ribera, who's a Spanish lawyer. And she seems to be taking a very different tack. So her mission letter from the commission president, which is a thing that outlines what the commission wants her to do, what wants her to focus on, kind of explicitly calls for a review of the merger guidelines, and it wants her to make them more sensitive to the industrial needs of the European economy. Reading between the lines, I think most people know what they mean by that. That's, if we have another Siemens Alstom, don't block it, let it happen. And she's given some kind of quotes in various places that have kind of implied that she's going to be sensitive to the needs to build scale. But I mean, while that's going on, there's kind of a parallel thing going on in the UK, which I think, Amy, you've been looking at, and I edited one of your pieces recently on that. So it's sort of, I take your point, Jonathan, that maybe there's like a kind of transatlantic schism going on, but they're all kind of like moving in the same direction, right? Towards like more friendly towards deal making, even if there's less cooperation on that side.
I mean, to certain, to greater and lesser extents, right? I mean, I guess what's interesting to me is this idea of like the Biden administration, like hard antitrust consensus that was forged on both sides of the Atlantic. It sort of took as its premise that American companies were going to be allowed to continue dominating a bunch of sectors. Like you say, like it's European companies were going to be kind of like still facing down this fragmented land market in Europe. You were not going to be able to build up to a sufficient kind of scale where, especially like, say, in the tech sector specifically, you were going to be able to push aside American dominance. And the trade-off for that was you had like this really like hard regulation and antitrust enforcement against tech companies. And this made a lot of people in the US very mad, even though it seems to me like, again, like its axiom was that American firms were going to be able to dominate Europe. And I just kind of wonder, like, how much do you feel like all of this fits into the broader theme of European self-sufficiency, or I guess like realistic chances that European industry has to kind of like come together and compete? Like, do you think that this is actually going to be like material and is going to make some effect, or is it, all kind of just like stuff around the margins?
So I think it depends where in Europe you're talking about. I think in the European Union, it is almost entirely about self-sufficiency. There's none of this talk that you hear in the UK about having a pro-growth competition agenda. It has this very like kind of economics 101 kind of flavor in the UK, and maybe, Amy, you could tell us more a bit about that, where the new Labour government is trying to kind of cut red tape to encourage growth, and there's a big antitrust element to that. But in Europe, it's not like explicitly around growth or like, let's get a few extra percentage points. But it's like there's a global war going on and we need big companies to not get squeezed out. We've been squeezed out for decades. No more. We need big companies. It really is as simple as that. And in terms of judging the plausibility of that, I think it's really tricky. I think what would be the deals that would build big European companies? What would be the sectors where you would have like, actual kind of champions? They love this phrase, European champions. The three that they've pinpointed is like, semiconductors, advanced tech, the telecoms industry, defense. You can go through every company and every possible permutation of deal in those sectors, and there are reasons why they don't always make sense. If you put Orange and Deutsche Telekom together, all you have is a German telecom that owns a US thing and a French telecom. You haven't really created something that's more than some of its parts. It's the same with, if you put Infineon and STM Micro, two of the bigger European chip makers, if you put them together, you haven't really created something that's more than some of the parts. There's very few instances where there's a kind of scale building merger that has cost synergies, revenue synergies, massive strategic benefit, and which is politically unpopular. So I kind of think like the Venn diagram of possible deals that they think exists, I can't find them. Maybe I'm just not looking hard enough. But anyway, that's the European side. I mean, what do you, on the UK side, Amy, do you think there are kind of deals that happen now that couldn't have happened before?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely when I was basically looking at the Competition Markets Authority in the UK, so that has as I said, it's got a new boss. And again, it's sort of reviewing the sort of metrics that it looks at deals. Like it's saying that they want to be faster, when they're looking at a deal that they think could be problematic and maybe is a threat to competition, that they will be much quicker to tell companies whether that's the case or not. They'll sort of look at the how much market share these companies would have. They're not saying that they're going to reduce what people had previously thought was going to be the sort of limit, which was around 25% market share. They're not saying that, but it's all the kind of mood music around it is, as you said, the Labour government wants the UK economy to grow. And for some reason, they think that these deals, by big deals happening, that could somehow help. The thing, though, that when I speak to kind of competition lawyers, is that they're puzzled by, and I have to say I'm puzzled by it as well, and even hearing your views, Liam, on Europe, is that the point of these commissioners or these regulators is they're supposed to promote competition, right? As in keep prices low. So there was a deal that got blocked before, which was Sainsbury's and Asda, two big grocers in the UK. And the truth was those two companies joining together was going to remove a lot of competition in certain areas of the UK. And so there was going to be huge remedies that were needed, like they'd have to sell off a load of stores. And it just didn't really make sense once those kind of suggestions happened. But that's what I'm kind of curious about, Liam and Jonathan. I'd love to hear your views on this. Is like, how do you square that circle of like, let's see really big deals. Let's see companies join forces. Yeah, maybe to create a European champion. But in the process of that, you remove competition, and I assume you drive up prices, right?
It especially depends on who the end customer is, right? Because you had this thing, I did a piece a while ago on the defense industry in the US, and this was the idea that we are going to allow the industry to slim down to build up these US defense champions who are then going to like drive the industrial base. Because after the end of the Cold War, you had a gaggle of all these folks who there wasn't enough budget to go around to support them anymore. The worry was that the industry was going to essentially like compete itself to death, and nobody would be able to build scale so that they could build terrible airplanes that don't really work. So you had that slimmed down to these 5 what are known as defense primes. But the thing is, you have like a price insensitive government buyer that is pretty easily like overmatched and overawed, it seems, by the companies against which it's contracting. And so you've now backed yourself into this position where it's like all of the path dependency has led to you are kind of trapped in a corner here, and you have senators like Elizabeth Warren, you have various other folks who get very exercised about this and say, oh, this is a big problem for us. We, our industrial base in defense now is like completely sclerotic. Like we need to shake that up. And like you see various stuff around contracting and others coming in. But like the essential point remains like you're kind of stuck with the 5 companies. And I'm going to presume like it's one thing if you're going after consumer markets and you're building up a colossus. It's like if anybody could point to saying like, oh, we'll just stick company A and company B together and create an Apple, I'm sure like Europe would love that. But like it's just not clear to me. Like you already have all of these markets where network effects are so strong, like they tend towards winner take all anyway. And it's not clear to me where you have like in anything that is like leveraged to the consumer market, which like a lot of tech is just to build scale, that you can just point at it and say like, okay, you have half, let's just put the whole thing together. Like, am I being overly pessimistic here? Or?
I totally agree. I mean, just to pick up I think it's quite troubling in a way. I mean, if you look at the evidence on industrial concentration, just kind of corporate concentration in major Western markets, I mean, it's only really been going up in recent decades. If you look at all of the kind of classic measures that antitrust bods use to look at these kind of things, I was looking at some data in the UK recently, and it was the CMA, which is the competition authority here, kind of they looked at, I think it was the percentage of revenue from the top 5 companies in every industry, and it was essentially after the 2008 financial crisis, it just went crazy. It really went upwards. And I mean, the real kind of landmark example of that is obviously tech and kind of US tech, where you've got kind of mega concentration in quite a small number of companies. And it does feel to me like, to the extent that we're rowing back on trust busting, it's coming at a pretty bad time from consumers' point of view. I mean, I just did a kind of very brief back of envelope exercise this morning where I took all of the stocks in the MSCI All Country World Index, which is like 80% of global equity or something, just divided net income by revenue, and it was like 8%, the kind of global aggregate listed margin in 2010, and it's gone up to 12%, and it's quite a like steady tick upwards. So I mean, there's a lot of things going on in there, but it does feel to me like corporate power and a lack of competition is definitely not less of a problem than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But the discussion around the competition agencies is almost like the opposite is true. Like, this has become terrible. You know, there's been this like war on mergers. We need to kind of, somehow this is going to unleash growth. And I just find that a little bit troubling as a kind of, you know, maybe more of a kind of classically inclined trustbuster kind of watcher. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the quandary that the current U.S. administration is trying to reason its way out of, right? Because it's under Lina Khan, and to a certain extent, we're going to get a third attempt on this podcast to pronounce her name, Margrethe Vestager. My understanding was that process was weaponized.
I think that was the best one yet.
I have Danish in-laws, what can I say? You know, you had what felt like, or at least people charged, was a weaponization of process, right? So you had something like, you know, Illumina and the weird way it got referred to EC competition authorities, or over in the US, you had all this stuff where you had like letters being sent out saying you're closing at your own risk, even though you're statutorily allowed to, or, you know, you had all this stuff where they were trying to tack on like the ability to screen future mergers as the cost of being approved now and all this kind of stuff. Like, they kept finding ways to try and get outside of the regular deal review process and just generally kind of tamp down on deal making. So the Trump administration is kind of indicated like, okay, we want to like nix all of that stuff. So presumably like the process cost is coming down, and therefore the hurdle rate for doing a deal is coming down like incrementally. But you're still seeing, you know, Ferguson, who now heads the FTC, had very forcefully kind of, and his deputies had forcefully reaffirmed this rewrite of the merger guidelines that happened in 2023 under Khan and her counterpart at the DOJ, Jonathan Kanter. And that was really a big sea change in terms of how U.S. regulators think about mergers. It was rowing away from, you know, the primacy of the price signal as your only measure of harm. It wanted trustbusters to think about labor markets and about, you know, kind of like hard to define head-to-head competition and all this kind of stuff. And despite a bunch of early failures, and I think I also was pretty skeptical of the way that Biden trustbusters did this stuff initially, because it's like, who cares that Facebook is buying some like tiny virtual reality developer? Like, why are you going after this stuff? But they did actually, through some of those cases, even the ones they lost, they ended up making me look kind of stupid, because they did inscribe like a bunch of stuff in legal precedent that ended up being really useful in future cases, and that momentum kind of built. So now there is like a big toolkit that current trustbusters can use, and they seem to kind of want to do it. They have blocked a couple deals already under the Trump administration that I don't think everybody was necessarily expecting. But it gets entangled with issues of, you know, corruption, obviously, under the Trump administration, and kind of like how I guess, objective and clear-eyed a lot of these decisions are going to be. But also they don't seem to really understand like what is their great overarching theory of what it is they're trying to do with antitrust, unless it's just like make tech, you know, kind of a little more wary of
bring it to heel.
Yeah, a little more wary of doing anything that annoys conservatives. But I don't know. I mean, like, I am curious, Amy, like in the UK, the CMA, I feel like there was a lot of excitement back after Brexit. It was like, oh, this is maybe like the one kind of like, let's say, progressive ideal that actually can be furthered. The CMA felt like it was kind of unchained to a certain extent. And it really did do some like pretty aggressive moves on like international deals. And it was suddenly something that like hedge funds and all these people like betting on deals had to care about. Like, do you have like any kind of sense of like what the received wisdom is about whether that was good or bad, or like people like are willing to claim the mantle of the CMA's legacy?
I mean, I think that they, as you said, I think they really put themselves on the stage for being an aggressive, you know, active regulator when it came to competition. I think the Microsoft Activision is probably the one that people kind of think of. It was like, what remit do you really have here? But at the same time, I think that what I think it just more generally, they really were thinking that they had the government behind them. I mean, they're an independent regulator, but they are appointed by the government. And both, like the Conservatives and Labour, seemed to be having the same sort of ideas about competition for quite a long time. And as I said, this government, it's very, very different. And from speaking to bankers, the types of deals that they don't seem to think are crazy are like the likes of BP and Shell, two big oil giants, both UK listed, that could now not necessarily like definitely get through, but certainly it's worth a shot. AstraZeneca, GSK, again, whenever I would write about GSK, I was always told nobody can ever buy GSK. It's a vaccine maker. The UK wants to keep it very much like within UK shores that it has this, particularly given the pandemic. But now you've got, again, AstraZeneca's UK listed. That would not be crazy as long as there's not too much overlap. So it's sort of starry-eyed bankers can sort of think about all of the deals that they may have been like, no, there's no point even discussing this, that they can now go to CEOs and go, well, why don't we just give it a shot? Why don't we see how far we can push this? Because the truth is, we don't really know. We don't really know at this point whether the kind of things that they're discussing, trying to be faster and I guess more proportionate with their remedies, whether that actually does open the door for very big deals. But it certainly looks, as I said, more accommodating than it has in the past.
It's only one way to find out. I guess you got to do a deal. I just wanted to pick up a point that Jonathan was saying, which I think is that I think we've all been saying, there's a lot of unknowns here, and I think that's true. But I think one thing that we can say with near certainty is that a lot of the intellectual energy has left the antitrust arena, if you know what I mean. I felt like there was this moment a few years ago where people like Lina Khan and Vestager, they were quite, they were conceptual heavyweights in a way. They were really thinking about this stuff and trying to advance beyond the kind of old playbook a little bit. You saw Lina Khan, Jonathan used to write a lot about that stuff, and she was thinking more about private equity and how do you think about a buyout firm that has portfolios, and you saw the CMA pick a lot of that stuff up. CMA did some really interesting work around online platforms, and it was saying, well, they're not charging consumers when you do a search, so how do we think about consumer prices? Let's go through the digital ad route, let's do some interesting work there. And then most notably of all, Vestager, kind of was instrumental in building this thing called the Digital Markets Act, which kind of takes an intuition that something has gone wrong with big tech and fleshes that out. And it was quite a kind of revolutionary piece of thinking. Whatever you think about it, you can't argue that it was new and it was kind of insightful in some way. It defines a bunch of gatekeepers in the digital arena and says, you have to play by special rules. And here are those rules. It's a list of do's and don'ts. If you qualify as a gatekeeper, we've got our eyes on you and we're watching you. That moment where antitrust had some intellectual energy and some spirit and some novelty to it, that feels like the big thing that has definitely changed. And I find that kind of interesting, and maybe it's a bit of a shame, but I think in terms of how this shakes out now, it feels like that stuff is, they're not going to be thinking of new ideas. The question is, to what extent do they walk away from that stuff? I think we've had your views, Jonathan, on, maybe Ferguson likes some of that Lina Khan stuff. There are a bunch of cases now that relate to the DMA in Europe. And the big question will be, what does Ribera do with them? Does she give Meta and Alphabet a kicking for perceived infractions of the DMA? And that's certainly what I'll be watching for.
Yeah, so if you are a banker listening to this might be music to your ears, that you can now pitch the crazy deals with lots of fees that you had previously thought about. But I think that there is a lot to contend with, that the M&A space, we haven't seen huge deals, and we haven't seen what we expected was a deluge after Donald Trump became president, because there's now an awful lot of things, right, to think about. There's tariffs and how all of this stuff will play out. So creating, Liam talked about a sort of Venn diagram that was already pretty narrow to begin with in Europe. It will be interesting to see just how narrow that gets, given all of the difficulties companies are facing at the moment. But this is what I intended this to be, was a kind of three-way chat between Liam, Jonathan and me. So, because we all had been covering this. So thank you so much, Liam. And thanks, Jonathan.
Of course.
Thanks.